There is a massive chasm between what history textbooks tell us and what we can observe in reality, provided we look with a professional eye. You only need to listen to the opinion of a master turner to see the official version of how many architectural monuments were created crumble into dust. When we are told that giant granite basins, like the Babalovo tub weighing 48 tons, were created by hand by masters who spent years polishing the stone, a professional can only smirk. The machining marks tell a different story. This is machine manufacturing, and of a level that surpasses many modern capabilities. Take the Alexander Column, for example. It isn't just a 600-ton piece of granite. It is a perfect solid of revolution, with a complex geometric shape. It has an entasis. It's not a simple cone. Physically, it is impossible to manufacture such an object without a gigantic lathe. If you asked any modern master to create even a scaled-down copy of such an object out of hard foam or wood, using only hand tools while demanding a perfect radius, they would refuse, calling the task absurd. Upon detailed study, it becomes obvious that such columns are complex engineering structures. Their components are fitted perfectly, and were likely parts of some technical devices from the past, the purpose of which is now unclear to us. The technologies used quite recently, just 200 or 300 years ago, are mind-boggling. We are talking about polygonal masonry, where blocks weighing hundreds of tons are joined with a precision unattainable for us, or geopolymer concrete methods that allowed for casting granite and marble. Sculptures made from a single piece of stone that imitate a thin veil or a fishing net also testify to the existence of high-precision programmable machines, not the genius of solitary men with hammers and chisels. However, by the end of the 19th century, this knowledge was completely lost, and the methods of working with artificial stone were forgotten. A logical question arises. Where did the civilization that possessed such powerful industrial potential disappear to? The answer likely lies in catastrophic events that occurred at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries. Researchers point to traces of a global conflict resembling a thermonuclear war. The result of this was a so-called nuclear winter and the year without a summer, recorded in the chronicles of 1816. In English-speaking sources, this period is grimly referred to as 1800 and froze to death, when the cold destroyed crops and vegetation. Traces of this cataclysm are imprinted on the planet's surface in the form of many perfectly round craters, which today have turned into lakes surrounded by ridges of broken limestone. In many countries, there are hundreds of them. Even more eloquent proof is the state of the forests. In the northern hemisphere, it is practically impossible to find trees older than 200 years. Most forests either burned down in the planetary war or froze out during the nuclear winter that followed. If you look at chronicles and the first photographs from the mid-19th century taken in Crimea or Siberia, you can see almost desert-like landscapes where vegetation is only just beginning to recover. After this catastrophe, human development was thrown back to the level of a feudal society. The survivors began to relearn the simplest technologies, gradually moving to coal and steam. Current civilization is merely a shadow of a bygone era. We are children playing on the ruins of giants. We cannot prove the superiority of our ancestors through their equipment, as it was scrapped or melted down during periods of chaos and recovery. However, the evidence lies literally beneath our feet, because a highly developed civilization would have required the entire periodic table, which means massive mining of natural resources. To see the truth, it is enough to apply the method of analogy to construction. Up to a certain point, houses were built from perfectly cut limestone blocks, with joints so tight you couldn't even slide a razor blade between them. The first floors of such buildings are now often buried several meters underground, which is observed in many cities around the world. Later, the quality of masonry dropped sharply, which indicates not progress, but a degradation of technology. The scale of mining for the main building material, limestone, in the past was exorbitant. What are called cave cities today are actually ancient quarries. The ruts in the stone, which are attributed to the carts of nobility, are actually traces of heavy mining machinery. If you mentally transport a modern stone quarry into the future by thousands of years and subject it to erosion, it will look indistinguishable from the historical monuments that guides pass off as ancient settlements. In the Crimean catacombs, which stretch for thousands of kilometers, distinct traces of circular saws with a diameter of about 2 meters are visible on the ceilings and walls. The thickness of the cut indicates that this was machine cutting, not manual labor. At the end of the 19th century, one could still catch scenes where huge segments were neatly sawed out of slopes, and entire villages were built inside the resulting niches. Huge volumes of rock were removed, leaving passages hundreds of meters wide. What is presented to us today as picturesque canyons, valleys, and gorges, upon closer inspection, turns out to be the result of excavation. Vertical cliff walls, at the foot of which lie piles of fine chips and non-standard stone, are a typical picture for an abandoned quarry. Rivers flowing along the bottom of such canyons did not wash out these channels over millions of years. They simply occupied the lowlands formed after heavy machinery removed the rock and opened up the aquifers. The entire surface of the planet represents a giant, barbarically exploited mine, where practically no living space remains untouched. If we try to find the answer to the question of where the creators of the megalithic masterpieces vanished, we inevitably face a grim hypothesis that completely overturns our understanding of the recent past. It is obvious that such a powerful civilization could not simply evaporate or leave peacefully, abandoning its cities and tools. Everything points to a global conflict, a massive catastrophe that divided history into before and after. Researchers comparing the facts conclude that at the turn of the 18th and 19th centuries, the planet survived a destructive impact, the consequences of which resemble a massive thermonuclear strike. Most likely, it was a war of annihilation, and possibly far from the first in Earth's history. A direct consequence of this event was a sharp climate change, which official science sheepishly calls the Little Ice Age, or local anomalies. However, chronicles have preserved the memory of 1816, which went down in history as the year without a summer. In English sources, it is grimly named 1800 and froze to death. That year, snow fell in the summer, crops died, and famine gripped entire continents. This is a classic description of a nuclear winter, when dust and soot raised into the atmosphere block access to sunlight, plunging the world into cold and twilight. Traces of this bombardment are still clearly visible on the planet's surface if you know where to look and what to search for. The territories of many countries, including Belarus and Ukraine, are literally dotted with strange, perfectly round lakes. These are not natural formations or traces of meteorite impacts. These are craters. Around many of them, you can find ridges of fractured limestone, the main building material of the previous era, thrown out by the blast wave. In regions where the groundwater level is high, these craters filled with water, forming lakes. Where the climate is drier, they remain gaping scars on the body of the Earth, silent witnesses to the tragedy. Another irrefutable proof of a recent catastrophe is the state of the forests. If you carefully study the forest massifs of the Northern Hemisphere, you can notice a strange pattern. It is practically impossible to find trees older than 200 years. The old relict forests, about which legends were composed, have disappeared. Part of them burned in the fires of a planetary war, and the other part froze out in the subsequent nuclear winter. To verify this visually, it is enough to turn to documentary evidence from the mid-19th century. The first war photographers, such as Roger Fenton and James Robertson, who arrived in Crimea in 1853 to photograph the siege of Sevastopol, captured landscapes strikingly different from modern ones. In their photos, we see an almost bare, scorched desert. There was almost no vegetation, and the slopes of the hills are exposed. This is the state of nature just 40 years after the alleged catastrophe. A similar picture is observed in photographs of Siberia from the end of the 19th century. Huge spaces where the forest is only just beginning to recover, thin trees breaking through the soil that survived the apocalypse. Humanity, having survived this hell, was thrown back in its development by centuries. We degraded to the level of a feudal society, losing access to the high technologies and knowledge of our ancestors. The regions that suffered the least, particularly the Anglo-Saxon world, benefited from this situation. Over a century and a half, they were able to crush the remnants of civilization, rewriting history to suit their needs. The Industrial Revolution, which is presented to us as the great achievement of the 19th century, was actually just an attempt to gather the shards of the past. The coal-fired steam engine and primitive metallurgy are a regression compared to geopolymer concrete and atmospheric electricity. Even the periodic table, allegedly dreamed up by a great chemist, was likely just a fragment of preserved knowledge thrown into scientific circulation in a distorted form. Current civilization is just a shadow of the past. We are children playing in a sandbox on the ruins of giants. It is impossible to prove this through an analysis of industrial equipment, as all machines of the past were destroyed. In periods of devastation, for example, after the collapse of large states, people, like ants, dug up remnants of communications, cables, pipes, from the ground to sell them for melting. The same thing happened on a global scale. We scrapped the legacy of our ancestors without understanding its true value. But while we were busy surviving and restoring a primitive way of life, we missed the most important thing. The surrounding landscape, which we are used to considering a natural environment, is actually artificial. We have been trained to call ruins cliffs and quarries gorges. We walk on land that has been dug up, processed, and changed beyond recognition. But our collective memory of this has been intentionally erased. We look at mountains and valleys, admiring their beauty, not even suspecting that before us are traces of the greatest robbery of the planet in history. To understand the true scope of the civilization whose legacy we mistake for natural landscapes today, we must pay close attention to what lies literally under our feet. The Crimean Peninsula serves as an ideal testing ground for such research. Official historiography and tourist guidebooks persistently offer us a romanticized version of the past, telling us about so-called cave cities like Eski Kerman or Çufut-Kale. They tell us that ancient people, monks or warriors, lived in these inaccessible rocks, chiseling out their cells and utility rooms with primitive tools for centuries. However, upon closer inspection, this version does not withstand criticism and crashes against the harsh facts of engineering reality. If we discard the tour guide's fairy tales and look at these objects through the eyes of an engineer or a miner, it becomes obvious. These are not dwellings, but remnants of massive industrial limestone mining. Strange ruts deeply cut into the stone plateau, which guides explain as heavy traffic of the local nobility's carts, cause only bewilderment. It is difficult to imagine how many millions of times a wooden cart must pass to cut a rut knee-deep into solid rock. It is much more logical to assume that these are traces of heavy cargo machinery that hauled away the rock when it was in a different state, or that the machinery possessed weight and power capable of deforming the stone. A thought experiment helps put everything in its place. If you take a modern stone quarry, with its smooth walls and rectangular excavations, and transport it 10 or 20,000 years into the future, subjecting it to ruthless wind and water erosion, the result will be indistinguishable from the Crimean cave cities. Smoothed corners and crumbled vaults are just the influence of time on an abandoned industrial facility. But the evidence is not limited to external resemblance. Facts are hidden underground that cannot be written off as erosion. Crimea is literally riddled with thousands of kilometers of catacombs, the volume of excavation in which is mind-boggling. Officially, it is claimed that the stone was mined with hand saws, starting from the time of the ancient Greeks. However, descending into these dungeons, one can find distinct traces of circular saws on the ceilings and walls. These are not chaotic chips from a pickaxe, but smooth, rhythmic marks of machine cutting. The thickness of the cut is about 4 millimeters, and the diameter of the cutting disc, judging by the radius of the traces left where the tool stopped, reached 2 meters. No human is capable of rotating a 2-meter disc by hand with such speed and precision to cut stone like butter. The Inkerman Quarry attracts special attention. Preserved images from the end of the 19th century show a colossal cut through a hill about 100 meters wide and 80 meters high. In the vertical walls of this giant man-made gorge, huge niches are visible, which were later adapted for housing or warehouses. At the foot of these walls lie mountains of fine limestone chips and substandard debris, typical production tailings, which over time became overgrown with forest and began to be perceived as a natural slope. During the Great Patriotic War, these giant excavations were used as ready-made bunkers where trucks drove in freely and hospitals and entire factories were located. The manipulation of consciousness lies in the substitution of concepts. What are called picturesque canyons and valleys are often the result of the extraction of millions of tons of rock. The White Rock in Belogorsk or the valleys of the Bakhchisarai region are quarry walls. The rivers flowing along the bottom of these gorges did not wash them out over millions of years. The water simply took the path of least resistance after mining machinery cut away layers of rock and opened up aquifers. A mountain range standing in the path of a river is a natural dam, and the river will always go around it unless someone artificially cuts a passage through it. This is exactly what we observe: giant cuts passed off as the work of modest streams. The impressive scale of mining in Crimea, where it seems there is not a single cubic meter of untouched rock, makes one think about the global picture. If such intensive processing of the subsoil was carried out on this small piece of land, what happened on the rest of the planet? After all, Crimea is just a tiny dot on the map. It is logical to assume that the masters of this reality did not limit their appetites to one peninsula. To assess the true scale of the theft of planetary resources, it is necessary to go higher and look at the Earth from above, where the mountains and gorges familiar to us will appear in a completely different, frightening light. If we look at our planet not as a wildlife sanctuary, but as an object of engineering analysis, the romantic veil falls away, revealing a frightening industrial reality. We are used to admiring the grandeur of mountain ranges and the depth of canyons, considering them masterpieces created by wind and water over millions of years. However, there is another view, based on comparing geological formations with the results of modern mining machinery. If we compare the profile of a quarry developed by a rotary excavator with some famous natural landmarks, the resemblance becomes not just obvious, it is shocking in its detail. Modern bucket wheel excavators are giants capable of gnawing into rock, leaving behind a specific geometric pattern. They remove soil in tiers, forming stepped structures, and often move in an arc, leaving characteristic semicircular cuts. Now, let's mentally magnify these traces hundreds of times and transport ourselves to the most remote corners of the planet. Greenland, Antarctica, Svalbard. Places that are officially considered almost untouched by man until recently. But upon careful study of the mountain ranges of these regions, for example, the Watkins Mountains or the Transantarctic Mountains, one can see the very same painfully familiar industrial patterns. Huge semicircular excavations, perfectly smooth terraces, and walls that look as if sliced by a giant knife. Official science claims that Antarctica was discovered only in 1820. However, its terrain preserves traces of barbaric exploitation that could have occurred long before the first polar explorers appeared there. The mountains look as if they were gutted, with everything valuable removed, leaving only an empty shell. The same applies to the sacred Mount Kailash in Tibet. Its pyramidal, stepped shape causes awe among pilgrims. But for a mining specialist, it is a typical spoil tip, or an outlier formed by tiered excavation. The height of over 6.5 kilometers makes the use of modern equipment there impossible. But who said that their machines were similar to ours and had the same limitations? The most striking example of global mystification is the Grand Canyon in the USA. Millions of tourists are told a beautiful legend about the Colorado River, which supposedly carved this stone for millions of years. But if you look closely at the structure of the canyon, the water erosion theory falls apart. The river is a thin thread at the bottom of a giant abyss. Water erosion creates V-shaped profiles, smooths corners, and changes the channel chaotically. The Grand Canyon demonstrates a clear structure with right angles, as if someone cut the rock out in chunks. The walls of the canyon bear traces of mechanical impact resembling the work of disc saws or rotary mechanisms of cyclopean size. This is not a riverbed. This is an excavated space, a giant quarry where mining was conducted on an industrial scale incomparable with the capabilities of our civilization. A similar picture is observed all over the world. Many U.S. national parks, such as Goblin Valley or Canyonlands, are essentially exhausted mines cynically named natural monuments. Nature does not tolerate straight lines and ideal geometric shapes. It strives for chaos and smoothing. But here we see strict order. Smooth walls, straight corridors, stepped amphitheaters. This is an industrial signature. We humans, with our excavators and bulldozers, look like children in a sandbox compared to those who carved up these continents. Their equipment, judging by the scale of the cuts, surpassed ours thousands of times over, allowing them to remove entire mountain ranges as easily as we scrape a layer of butter off a sandwich. The realization that Earth is a giant mine changes the perception of reality. We live on a processed object. But if mountain ranges and canyons are places where rock was actively removed, slicing it off in layers and tiers, a logical question arises. What remains after the top layer of the planet, hundreds of meters thick, is completely removed? When a planetary-scale rotary excavator finishes its work and drives away, it leaves behind a flat, lifeless platform. And the scariest part is that we see these platforms every day on geographical maps, without even suspecting what they truly represent. The answer to this question will horrify you with its obviousness, because we are used to calling these zones by completely different names. The most frightening part of this industrial investigation begins when we shift our gaze from the vertical walls of canyons to horizontal spaces. If we imagine the work of a rotary excavator removing rock layer by layer, it becomes obvious that the final result of its activity is a perfectly flat platform cleared of everything superfluous. This is the so-called quarry floor. Now, let's look at a map of the world, especially at those zones marked in yellow and designated as deserts. Comparing these two images leads to a shocking conclusion. The planet's greatest deserts are not quirks of climate, but the bottoms of giant, exhausted quarries. The scale of soil removal in these zones defies comprehension from the point of view of ordinary human logic. It seems that a planetary ripper worked on the planet, methodically removing the upper fertile layer along with vegetation, animals, and soil to a depth of hundreds of meters. Huge territories of Central Asia, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Iran, are devoid of fertile soils not because there is simply a drought. The landscape geometry suggests that a colossal layer of rock was sliced off this territory. Tracks and plateaus in Kazakhstan, for example, show clear boundaries where the machinery stopped. We see elevations that are remnants of the former surface level, and huge lowlands leveled like a table, which have become deserts. This is especially clearly visible in the example of the famous Monument Valley in the USA. These red rock buttes rising in the middle of a flat desert are not the result of weathering. These are witnesses, a term from geology denoting sections of rock left to assess the initial volume of deposits. The tops of these rocks show the level at which the ground surface was located before mining began. The entire space between them was scooped out, hauled away, and processed, leaving only a bare stone foundation. A similar picture is observed in the Namib Desert, in Egypt, and in the Red Deserts of Australia. These are territories scraped to zero, where soil is absent as a class, and the surface represents bare bedrock or a layer of sedimentary deposits. Some of these giant pits subsequently filled with water, turning into seas and lakes whose origins raise questions among hydrologists. The Sea of Azov, for example, fits perfectly into the theory of a flooded quarry. Its bottom is flat as a table, and the maximum depth does not exceed 15 meters, which is completely uncharacteristic for natural tectonic depressions. If we drain the Azov, we will see a typical platform on which skyscraper-sized rotary excavators once rolled. There is a version that thorium was mined in this region, which is confirmed by the presence of radioactive sands in the Azov region. The Aral and Caspian Seas also bear signs of the artificial origin of their basins. When we look at satellite images, we see that a significant part of the land is colored in yellow-orange tones. These are the colors of exposed subsoil. We are used to thinking that a desert is a natural ecosystem, but relief analysis says the opposite. Deserts are anthropogenic. They appeared as a result of long-term predatory metallurgical activity of a highly developed civilization. Either it was planned resource extraction by the inhabitants of the past themselves, or barbaric exploitation after the capture of the planet by an external force. In any case, the result is the same. The fertile skin of the Earth was stripped off, and the exposed flesh of the planet dried out under the sun. However, any production process of mining minerals is inevitably linked to the law of conservation of mass. If you extract billions of tons of ore from the depths, you cannot simply dissolve it into the air. Mining always consists of two stages: obtaining valuable concentrate and disposing of waste rock. If deserts, seas, and canyons are places of extraction, those very giant holes in the body of the Earth, then somewhere there must be mountains of waste material corresponding to them in volume. We look at the surrounding landscape with admiration, photographing majestic peaks and cone-shaped elevations, not even suspecting that we are actually admiring toxic waste from enrichment production, which ancient industrialists simply dumped in piles. Any industrial activity, especially on the scale of planetary mining, obeys the relentless logic of material balance. If we admit that giant canyons and deserts are places of rock removal, the question inevitably arises: where did the billions of tons of waste material go? It is not enough to simply mine ore. It must be enriched by separating the valuable concentrate from the so-called waste rock. At modern mining and processing plants, this leads to the formation of huge spoil tips and tailings dams. If we extrapolate this process to the past, we must look for artificial mounds of colossal size on the Earth's surface. And they are in plain sight. We are just used to calling them volcanoes, hills, and picturesque knolls. Look at the structure of a typical spoil tip, for example, in the Donbass Coal Basin. It is a cone-shaped mountain of loose rock inside which continuous chemical reactions are taking place. Under the pressure of its own mass, and due to the presence of coal residues or chemicals inside the tip, the temperature rises. It begins to burn, smoke, and sometimes even explode, throwing out hot gases and ash. Now compare this description with the behavior of the famous Vesuvius in Italy. we are told that this is a volcano, a natural window into the fiery depths of the Earth. But if you look into the caldera of Vesuvius, we do not see granite walls melted by lava, characteristic of a magma breakthrough. The walls consist of layered, loose rock that can be dug with an ordinary shovel. This is the classic structure of a man-made spoil tip. Its eruptions are not the wrath of the gods or tectonic activity, but the result of excess gas pressure accumulated inside from the chemical combustion of waste. This hypothesis explains the nature of many iconic peaks. Kluchevskaya Sopka in Kamchatka, an ideal cone almost 5 kilometers high. Mount Fuji in Japan. Mount Taranaki in New Zealand. All of them have a suspiciously regular geometric shape, characteristic specifically of man-made structures. Geology does not draw with a ruler. It creates chaos. But here we see unified, standard dump projects. The explosions of these volcanoes and the flowing lava may be waste rock melted during internal exothermic reactions mixed with chemical reagents of ancient processors. Even the so-called chocolate hills in the Philippines are more than 1,000 identical cones scattered over a huge territory, which looks more like dump trucks unloading than a whim of nature. Another uncomfortable question concerns the origin of sand. We are used to considering deserts natural formations, but why do huge masses of sand accumulate in the centers of continents, far from seas and oceans? Sand, in its chemical essence, is silicon dioxide, quartz. In the mining industry, the ore enrichment process often requires crushing it into dust to increase the contact area with chemical reagents. After extracting the metals, waste rock remains, that very quartz sand. If you look at the world map, sandy deserts are surprisingly adjacent to mining zones. The Great Deserts of Nevada are located next to the Grand Canyon. The sands of Central Asia and the Middle East surround gutted mountain systems. All this sand is nothing more than waste from enrichment production, the very sludge that is no longer needed. It was simply dumped into lowlands or used to fill exhausted quarries. The abundance of sand in river valleys also finds a logical explanation. Waste was dumped into the water and the current carried it along the channel. That is why river sand often consists exclusively of quartz and not of the minerals through which the river flows. This is the trash trail of civilization. The colored mountains in China or Peru, which tourists admire, represent an even more sinister spectacle. Their bright, unnatural colors, red, yellow, turquoise, testify to a high concentration of chemical compounds. This is not natural beauty, but toxic dumps, where processed ores soaked in reagents lie in layers. Walking there without protective gear may be unsafe for health, but tourists are not told about this, as routes are laid along specially designated paths. Thus, the majestic picture of nature that we observe crumbles, giving way to a grim, industrial panorama. Mountains are piles of trash. Volcanoes are burning landfills. Sands are chemical tailings. The entire surface of the planet was dug up, ground down, chewed up, and spat out. Earth is not the pristine cradle of humanity, but a giant, exhausted mine, where practically no living space remains. This puzzle has come together, and the image on it is frightening in its hopelessness. But what does this knowledge mean for us, those who live here and now? We build our cities on someone else's dump, not suspecting that our civilization is possibly just a temporary caretaker at a closed facility. The realization that our planet is a giant, practically exhausted quarry leads to an inevitable and frightening philosophical conclusion. All our history, all our achievements and ambitions are just fussing about on a dump left by a more powerful force. We are like ants inhabiting an abandoned factory. We use debris of old structures, melt down rusty parts, and take pride in learning to extract crumbs of resources from waste piles that the previous owners considered trash. We are not the masters of the earth. We are a parasite civilization finishing the leftovers from the master's table, living on toxic waste from enrichment production, which we poetically call soil and sands. Looking into the future through this prism becomes even grimmer. If we want to see the final station of our route, we do not need to guess or build complex mathematical models. It is enough to look through a telescope at our neighbor, Mars. The red planet is, apparently, a visual example of what happens to a celestial body when the resource extraction process is brought to its logical conclusion. Mars is a quarry mined to the foundation. Its atmosphere is stripped, water evaporated or pumped out, and the surface is covered with a thick layer of oxidized dust, rust remaining after the total processing of the subsoil. The giant volcanoes of Mars, such as Olympus Mons, are the same spoil tips, only much more massive, testifying that industrial capacities there worked to the limit until they exhausted everything. This perspective forces us to rethink the very purpose of humanity. People, states, and nations come and go, conflict and disappear into oblivion. But the process of processing matter does not stop. Perhaps our biological form of life is just a temporary stage necessary to service the quarry during its conservation or sluggish development. We are too fragile. We need oxygen, water, a specific temperature. We depend on the biosphere, which we ourselves are destroying by trying to repeat the technological feats of our predecessors. However, the logic of industrial development suggests the next step. We ourselves, with our own hands, with maniacal persistence, are developing and building those who will replace us. We are talking about the creation of artificial intelligence and self-replicating robotic systems. Silicon lifeforms, which we strive to create, will become ideal workers for the final stage of gutting the planet. They will not require an atmosphere. They will not be afraid of background radiation or lack of water. They will be able to function effectively in conditions similar to Martian ones, and finish what their creators, or those who stood above them, did not have time or did not want to finish. We will go down in history having fulfilled our function as a biological starter for the machine of eternal extraction. There is an old expression that, in the context of this theory, takes on a sinister, literal meaning. God's mills grind slowly, but surely. This is not about higher justice or karma. This is about the relentless, mechanical process of processing everything that exists. The millstones of this universal mill turn leisurely, grinding mountains into sand, oceans into salt deserts, and civilizations into a cultural layer. The wheel moves steadily, and absolutely everything will be subject to change. We stand on the threshold of understanding that our role in the universe may be purely utilitarian. Earth has already given up its best resources. The giant trees of the Silicon era have been cut down, precious metals exported, the fertile layer removed. We live in the era of project closure at the remediation stage, which apparently does not foresee a return to a pristine paradise. Most likely, the fate of Mars awaits us, to become a cold, lifeless monument to the greatest theft in the history of the star system, where the wind will eternally drive quartz sand along the bottom of empty oceans, covering the traces of our vanity. And only silent spoil tips, which we mistook for majestic volcanoes, will remain eternal monuments to this planetary production. The process is not complete, and the millstones continue their work, indifferent to the fates of those who temporarily inhabit the surface of the processed material.